Right. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone. My name is Ishen, and I'm from the University of Pretoria here in South Africa. And I will be the moderator today for this webinar on Afrobarometer's 34-country survey on Africans' perceptions towards China's role in Africa. So specifically is its economic and political role, but also how it compares to other players. Last time we discussed this topic last year, September, and we looked at the preliminary results, where we found that China is still important in terms of its economic and political role in Africa. This was confirmed, but at the same time, we saw its influence seem to slip slightly when compared to 2014-2015 results in round 6. So this topic of African citizen perceptions is an important one, as it helps us better understand the nature of Africa-China ties holistically. If you were to do an internet search on Africa-China or China-Africa, often images of men in suits as well as trade figures dominate. And this is very much in line with the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which is a meeting between policymakers. And the forthcoming 8th iteration of FOCAC will be hosted by Senegal. At the same time, it is quite interesting because this time around, there are survey results that represent West African country citizens as well as Senegal. So by taking the temperature on public sentiment in Africa, we can begin to get a sense of whether citizen perceptions reinforce this formal image or not. And more complexly, we can begin to understand why African citizens think the way they do, but also begin to think about what informs these impressions. So we are very lucky today to have a line of experts who will help us highlight what is curious about these findings, but also help us put the data into context. So I will introduce each speaker just before they speak in the interest of time. I will remind all of you that please share your thoughts, questions, as well as anything that you find interesting in the chat function and Q&A. We had really interesting side discussions the last time during the preliminary results, and I will do my best to collate this to share with the speakers during the discussions. For any other housekeeping matters, please check the chat function. I think the hashtag is there and other points. So with that introduction, I will now move to the formal presentation. I'm going to introduce Dr. Adam Salome, who is the Director of Research at the Ghana Center for Democratic Development, and she has the major task of presenting the full survey findings to us. The screen is yours, Adam.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back again to do the presentation. Just 1 minute. Hello, can everybody hear me clear now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Oh, sorry about that. I had a bit of a hitch here. All right. So as I was saying, I'm glad that we're back almost a year after we presented the 18 country results to now share the full results on our findings on China. But as always, before I get into the exciting findings, I'm going to speak a bit about Afrobarometer, the Afrobarometer survey, what we do, and then we'll take it from there. Just for those who don't know what Afrobarometer is, it is a Pan-African network, a non-partisan survey research network that provides reliable data on African experiences, evaluations, and aspirations regarding democracy, governance, and good quality of life in Africa. We've had 8 rounds of surveys since it started in 1999. We've completed up to 39 countries since the first round was conducted. The survey findings that I'll be presenting today covers 34 countries. So the core objectives for Afrobarometer's existence is to produce scientifically reliable data and analysis on public opinion in Africa. It is also aimed to strengthen the capacity of African institutions for democratic governance and survey research and analysis. And then finally, to broadly disseminate and apply democratic governance survey results. Afrobarometer, of course, has become the leading source of reliable data on what Africans think, their experiences, and political behaviors. And this data is made to the public, available through the website, through what we're doing now. And the goal, of course, is to give the public a voice in policymaking by providing our high quality public opinion data to policymakers, policy advocates, civil society organizations, academics, news media, and donors and investors. Now, I'll show you.
Adam. Sorry, Adam, could you please go into full screen mode?
Josephine is handling that from her end.
Okay,
so
let me just check. Okay, that's fine. You can continue, sorry.
All right, so the map that you see right now on your screen is where Afrobarometer has conducted a survey. Now, the gray areas, the lighter shade that you see is where we haven't done a survey at all. And the deeper colors is where we've done a survey since, the red colors are where we've done a survey since 1999 when it started. Now, I'll move on to the most important part of what Afrobarometer does, which is how we collect the data, which is the methodology. And so for all of our surveys, Afrobarometer partners with who we call a national partner in each country. So for all of the 34 countries that we're reporting on today, we've had partner organizations that collected the data for us. So the survey is done in a face-to-face interview mode in the language of the respondent's choice, which means that the questionnaire is translated into a local language that the respondent can respond in. It's a nationally representative sample of adult citizens of 80 years and above. All respondents are randomly selected, so everybody has equal chance of being in the sample. The sample, of course, because it's random as well, is distributed across the states, regions, and provinces as we have in Africa. It also covers the urban and rural areas of the population in proportion to their national share in the national population. And so the questionnaire is the same across countries, except when in some cases, some questions are not asked in those countries. The questionnaire is the same for each country, which makes it possible for us to do cross-country comparisons and over time as well. The sample size is either 2,400 or 1,200 for some countries. And with the sample side, we get a country level results with a margin of error of plus or minus 3 percentage points at a 95% confidence level. So now that I've got the methodology out of the way, I'm going to now move on to the findings, and I will begin with one of the key questions we ask, which is the development model. China as a development model for African countries. And here the idea is to get opinions on the best model for development. So Afrobarometer will ask Africans, which country provides the best model for future development of their own country. All right, so this result is for 34 countries, and it covers the most current round of the Afrobarometer survey 2019-2021. And in general, we see that Africans still have a positive view towards China. And China ranks second as the best model for development to the US, and still the US is still far preferable to their former colonial powers. We also see that in some African countries prefer to follow their own country's model at 7% there, and I think that's good to see this time around. So we'll look at this particular question at the country level and see whether there's some differences in the findings from when we first asked that question. So again, out of 34 countries surveyed between 2019 and 2021, which is this year, the US model is more attractive than the Chinese model in 23 countries. However, the preference for China surpasses the US by very large margins in 3 Francophone countries. And these countries are Benin, as you can see from the chart, Burkina Faso, and Mali. And we see that there's 23 percentage points, 18 percentage points up, and 13 percentage points up, respectively, for these 3 countries, although we see that there's a moderate 4 percentage point up for Niger as well. So whilst we're seeing these changes in these 3 Francophone countries, we also see that in Eswatini, Tunisia, Malawi, Mozambique, Senegal, Botswana, and Tanzania, we see equal preferences for both models. So either the Chinese model or the US model, we see there's equal preference for that model in these countries. Okay, so one of the things that we also try to do is look at the positive perception of Chinese and the US influence, whether this follows the similar patterns for the key socio-demographic groups. So again, we see for both countries, men and highly educated citizens are somewhat more likely than women, and less educated citizens to see the influence as positive. So the model, the Chinese model. So again, younger Africans are more likely than their elders to prefer the US model at 36%, and those who are aged 55 years old and above. So younger people see the US model, they prefer the US model to older people. However, with regards to the Chinese model, it is fairly steady across age groups. As you can see, we see that it doesn't matter what the age group is if it comes to the Chinese model. And again, men are equally likely to prefer the United States, but more men than women, which is 25% more men than women, prefer the Chinese model. We also see, again, that respondents' experience with poverty makes some difference in their preferred development model. Now, when we talk about the poverty levels in the Afrobarometer survey, we are referring to what we call the lived poverty index, which is based on experiential poverty of Africans. So Afrobarometer will ask a number of questions which measures the respondents' level of deprivation by asking how often they and their families went without basic necessities such as food, medical care, enough cooking fuel, and cash income during the preceding year. So this is what we call the lived poverty index in Afrobarometer. And we are saying that it doesn't, when we look at the lived poverty index, it doesn't make any difference as to, just a bit of difference as to whether they prefer the Chinese model or the US model for development. So now let's look at the change in preference of the Chinese model as the best development model, whether the percentage changes over time since 2014 to 2021. So again, we see that on average across 31 countries in which the question was asked, and I must say 31 countries at this point because the question was not asked in some countries when we asked it for the first time in round 6, which was in 2014-15. We see that the preference for China as a best model for development remains unchanged. But 2 Francophone countries record very drastic increases. And again, it's Benin, 21 percentage points up since when it was first asked, the question was first asked in that country. And Burkina Faso as well, 20 percentage points up since the time it was asked in 2014. But Cameroon and Eswatini and Liberia record significant decreases. So whilst we see increases in these 2 countries, we've seen some decreases in the preference for China as a best model in Eswatini, Liberia, where we see significant decreases of -25% and 17% respectively for Liberia and Eswatini. Cameroon went down by 25%. So as far as the US model preference is concerned, we see that it's doubled in Lesotho from 14% to 28%. So an increase sharply in Sierra Leone again by 12 percentage points. However, we also see a decrease in the preference for the US model in 7 countries, including Cabo Verde, which is 9 percentage points down, in Botswana, 9 percentage points down, and in Nigeria, 7 percentage points down, and Burkina Faso, 7 percentage points down as well. So again, we don't see all the countries because we didn't ask the question in Angola and in Ethiopia. Angola was added to the country set in round 8 survey. So let's look at the changes in preference for the US model as a best model over time. So we're looking at it again for 31 countries and from 2014 to 2021. Again, we see the preference for the US model has doubled in Lesotho, as I said earlier, from 14% to 28%, and has increased sharply in Liberia by 18 percentage points, Morocco by 16 points, Sierra Leone by 11 percentage points, and has reduced by 3/4 in Eswatini from 20% to 5%. So the preference for that model has decreased in Eswatini and decreased in 8 other countries, including Cabo Verde by 10 percentage points, Botswana by 8 percentage points, Burkina and Kenya and Nigeria by 7 points respectively. So that's what we've seen for the best model for development for both China and the US over time. Now I'm going to move on to what we call external influence. The question here is we are looking at what Africans' views are on political and economic influences by external actors. So these could be either the former colonial master, the UN, or China, or the US, as in this case. So again, we see the ratings of external influences in 34 countries. Again, China's economic and political influence in Africa, like the United States, is far more widely seen as a good than a bad thing. So on average, we see that about 6 in 10 Africans, 63%, say China's influence in their country is somewhat positive or very positive, while only 1 in 7, 14%, consider it negative. Views on the US influence are also about the same, which is 60% versus 13%. And then we also see that Africans also acknowledge a positive influence of their regional superpower, which is at 52%, and therefore former colonial power 46%, and then of course Russia at 35%. We also see again some positive assessments that the positive assessments far outnumber the negative views of the influence of the United Nations. So we see 57% positive for the United Nations and only 11% negative views. And then we also see the same for the regional organizations as well. So this would include the ECOWAS and all the sub-regional bodies. We see a positive rating there at 57% versus 12%. And of course, for the African Union at 53% versus 14%. So again, I must say this question was not asked. The question on the influence of regional superpower was not asked in Kenya. The question on influence of the former colonial power was not asked in Ethiopia. The question on influence of Russia was not asked in Botswana, Ethiopia, Kenya, Malawi, Namibia, and Uganda. I'm stating this because if you look at the numbers at the country level, you would see that these countries are missing. So again, let's look at it at the country level. So we are looking at now the positive influence of China versus the US, just those two. And we also see again that on average, the 34 countries, there's no significant difference in positive perceptions of Chinese and the US influence. Actually, respondents who feel positively about the influence of China are more likely to hold positive views of the US influence as well. That is, the two views are strongly and positively correlated. And this suggests that many Africans see the US-China competition as a win-win situation rather than one or the other. However, we see the differences vary at the country level. So in 14 out of the 34 countries, positive perceptions of China's influence outstrip the US, including 36 percentage points gap in Eswatini, 82 percentage positive for China there, and 46% positive for the US. We also see a 25 percentage point gap in Mauritius. And there again, we see a 75 percentage positive for China and 50% for the US. And then we see a 19 percentage point gap in Mali, where we see an 81% positive for China and 62% positive for the United States. The US is perceived to have more positive influence than China in 10 countries. But Zimbabwe is the only country with a two-digit gap for 48% for the US and 38% for China. So I'm now going to move on to the perceived change, positive change of influence for China in percentage points. Now this is for 30 countries. Again, on average, we see that in the 30 countries where this question was asked, the positive ratings for China's influence has remained unchanged at 66% and 63%, just a marginal change. And in 17 countries, we see a decline, including steep drops in Gabon at negative 21%. So we've seen a drop by 21 percentage points. In Namibia, we see a drop again at 19 percentage points. In Cameroon, we see 16% percentage points drop. And in Niger, it's 16 percentage points drops. Again, only 6 countries, as you can see from the chart, show significant increases in the proportion of citizens who see Chinese influence as positive. So there, Morocco, we see a huge jump in Morocco at 45 percentage points up. And then in Benin, it's 18 percentage points up. And of course, in Ghana, 14 percentage point up. Lesotho, it's 7 percentage points up. And in Cabo Verde and Tanzania, it's 4 percentage points up, respectively. So now I'm moving on to the extent of China's economic activities in Africa. So part of the things that people consider positive about China is its economic activities in Africa. Again, we see that on average across the 34 countries, the majority, close to 60% of Africans are saying that China's economic activities in their countries have some or a lot of influence on their economy. So let's look at what this says at the country level. Again, we'll look at the change over time. So from 2014 to this year, 2021, I seem to be tongue twisting when it comes to the year 2021, but I'm sure I'll get over it. So we see that there is a major decrease over the past 5 years from 71% of this positive outlook towards China's influence economically in their countries to 59% across 30 countries surveyed in 2014 to 2021. So the perceptions of Chinese influence declined in 24 out of 30 countries surveyed in both survey rounds, round 6 and round 8. So this includes huge drops in Sierra Leone, where we see a 37 percentage point drop. In Zimbabwe, where we also see a 29 percentage point drop in this positive outlook for China's economic activities in Africa. We also see the same for Botswana, 24 percentage point drop, and in Malawi we see 21%. Niger is 21%, and then in Mali we see a drop there, 20% point drop. It's only in Morocco and Mauritius where we see a significant increase in this perceived influence, Chinese economic influence. And the proportions who see Chinese economic activities as influential still exceeds 2/3 in Morocco. So there in Morocco is 80%, Cape Verde, it's 77%, Mauritius 75%, Eswatini 74%, and it goes all the way down Benin, Gabon, Kenya, Cameroon, Sudan, and Mali. But we also see that fewer than half of citizens agree in Ethiopia. So this question was asked in Ethiopia in the current round of surveys. 47% agree in Ethiopia, and in Uganda 44%, and Zimbabwe 39%, Malawi and Sierra Leone in that order, where we see marginal drops in the perceived Chinese economic influence in their country. So let's move on now to the most vexed question, which is a development assistance from China, where we see that between 2000 and 2019, Chinese grants of loans have granted loans for about 153 billion to Africans, so African countries. So what are the views of Africans regarding the loans that their countries receive from China? And again, we see that in spite of the increase in investment and support in Africa, fewer than half of its citizens, 47%, are aware that China gives loans or development assistance to their countries. Awareness of China's provision of loans or development assistance varies from 2/3 or more in Kenya, where we see 74% saying that they know, and Mauritius at 70%, and Cape Verde at 69%, to fewer than 3 in 10 in Sierra Leone, where 30%, and in Morocco 28%, and in Nigeria 28%, and Tunisia 24% are saying that they are unaware that their countries receive loans from China. So let's look at this question at the country level as well. Again, we see that about 75% of those who are aware, so now we are only looking at those who said they were aware of Chinese loans to their countries, that their countries receive development assistance from China, are also aware that their governments will likely be required to repay the loans. So we see that except in Lesotho, where majorities in all the surveyed countries are aware of this obligation, and including about 9 in 10 citizens in Kenya, Guinea, Uganda, and Ghana, and Zambia, where people are aware that their countries have to pay. And then we see the majority again, 57% of those who are aware of China's assistance say their countries have borrowed too much from China. So Kenyans, Namibians, Zambians, and Angolans are particularly concerned about their government's indebtedness to China, while only 3 in 10 Tanzanians, 29%, and same with Sierra Leoneans and Botswanans express such concern. So while we see there's a lot of concern in some countries, others do not show that much concern about this. So again, let's look at China's conditionality compared to other countries. So conditionalities that come with the loans, so what Africans' views are regarding this. And we asked this question in 33 countries. So again, we see that among those citizens who are aware that their countries receive loans or development assistance from China, a quarter, 24%, think China attaches more requirements to assistance than other countries, while a little over 4 in 10, which is 41%, say financial support from China comes with somewhat fewer or far fewer strings attached. And then again, we see that on an average, 55% say foreign donors or lenders should allow governments to make their loan decisions about how to use the resources. So this is in regards to how the funds are spent. But a significant minority of 42% prefer strict requirements. So whilst this again is about those who know about the loans and how their government spent the loans that they receive. Again, we see that half or more of citizens reject strict requirements from lenders in 24 out of the 34 countries. And this includes large majorities in Senegal, Niger, Tunisia, Malawi, and Zambia, where we see an equal split actually in Malawi and Zambia, where 49% of people think that the lenders should reject strict requirements. But we also see that support for loan conditionalities is strongest in Liberia, where we see 60%, followed by Gabon, 55%, Eswatini, 53%, Sierra Leone, 53%, and then in Mauritius, 51%. But in Angola, we see that Angola is among the countries with the least support for government to take its own decisions regarding the loans that it take. We also see that it reports the largest proportion of citizens who agree with neither of the views, or we see that there are a lot of don't knows in Angola regarding this question. Of 23% don't know how to answer this question. So, but still on the loans, we also wanted to see what Africans' views are on whether the loan should be tied to the promotion of democracy and respect of human rights. And again, we see that Africans are more closely divided on whether donors and lenders should make sure that countries receiving assistance promote democracy and respect human rights. So on average, slightly more than half, which is 51%, want their governments to be free to make their own decisions about democracy and human rights. But almost as many, 46%, want assistance to come with these strings attached. So, but 46% want the loans to be attached to the promotion of democracy, respect for human rights. As regards this question of conditionalities for how resources are used, again, we see that we see a similar trend with this question as well. So again, we look at the support for democratic norms and institutions by those who prefer the China model over the US model. And this is one of the analysis that we threw in for this particular presentation. We didn't add this in the last time we shared the findings with you. So what are the views of Africans and how their loans from China or support from China affects their attitudes towards democracy? So we see that views on whether China or the United States is preferable as a development model does not appear to have any significant effect on African support for democracy or democratic norms. And respondents who prefer China as a development model are just as likely as those who prefer the US model to favor democracy over other kinds of governance systems. They are also equally likely to reject one-party rule. They are more likely to support presidential term limits and rather support elections as the best way to choose their country's leaders, support multi-party competition, and prioritize accountable government over an efficient one. So the preference for China versus, so this for us shows that the preference for China versus the US doesn't appear to be linked to the commitment to democracy. And the same holds true if we look at the differences between those who say China has positive influence and those who say it has negative influence. So there's little discernible difference in the levels of commitment to democracy between the two groups. So let's look at the assessment of supply of demand, supply of democracy. So again, on the supply side, we might have expected that people who prefer the China model would have lower standards by which they rate the democraticness, and therefore ratings of how democratic a country is would be higher. We see some modest indication here, though. I mean, the differences are all in the same direction. That those who prefer China, the Chinese model, give better ratings on supply indicators, but the differences are mostly small and only significant on two of the indicators, which is the presidential accountability to laws and then courts. So I'm going to conclude the finding with one of the questions we asked the last time on the best international language. And so we, as usual, asked what Africans' views on the best international language is. And again, although we see that China's pursuit of culture, the so-called cultural soft power, for example, via its expanding network of the Confucius Institutes across Africa, the continent still appears to be making little progress, and this soft power is not making that much progress, because when we ask which international language Africans think is most important for young Africans to learn, we see that 7 in 10 respondents still prefer English, and 14% still prefer French, and only 3% choose Chinese. So again, English is still the most valued language for Africans for Africans, and we see that those with secondary education is highest. The preference for English is highest with those with secondary education. So this is where I bring the presentation to a close. Of course, the data is on the website where people can download on the Afrobarometer website and do their own analysis if they so wish. So thank you very much for your time, and sorry again for the initial hitches. Right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam, for the presentation. And I always find the language question such an interesting one. And this came up a lot the last time. And it's also interesting, as we know, that English still mediates a lot of the Africa-China relationship. Even if you look at the FOCAC documents, it's in English. I was also happy to see that I think this is the first time that Portuguese and Kiswahili also features on the survey results in terms of languages. So now we are going to go straight to the analysis of the data, and I'm going to follow the order of the program. So first up, we have Dr. Folashada Soleil. She's from the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. And also, Folashada has been providing quite a bit of commentary around the upcoming FOCAC meeting. So we really look forward to hearing her thoughts. Over to you, Folashada.
Thank you very much, Yushan. Thank you, Adam, for the presentation. I think that the release of the Afrobarometer full data covering 34 African countries, among which Angola also was the latest, newest edition, is most welcome as we are heading up to the FOCAC ministerial meeting that is taking place at the end of this month in Dakar, Senegal. So very briefly, I think there are many takeaways, but I will summarize them in 4 key learning outcomes that are important for both China-Africa analysts, but also for policymakers. First one is the confirmation that there's no monopoly or just a US-China duopoly of influence in Africa. So there hasn't been a big change between 2014 and 2021. Comparatively speaking, China loses just 1 percentage point, while the US gains 1 on at least the 31 country average. And so this already confirms that in the context of US-China rivalry on the continent, that African citizens surveyed seem to consider both models as best for their future development models of their countries, at least. And as Adam said, so this the US-China models, but also the rivalry does not constitute an either or dilemma for ordinary African citizens. On the contrary, it shows that it's rather a win-win situation. So that's a very important takeaway here, especially for those analyzing US-China rivalry in Africa, but also maybe globally. When you look more into the details, there are some changes that are noteworthy, changes in preference for the US and for China models. In the case of preference, the change of preference for China, it's very interesting for me, who has been observing Benin, for instance, for the last decade, that there's an increase of plus 31 percentage points in favor of the Chinese development model. And I'm not totally surprised by this. There's been a strong push from China at different levels of engagement, not only economic, but also at the security, cooperation level, cultural level, all this knowledge transfer with several training, scholarships, offers for different publics, different audiences to discover China and the Chinese model and emulate it at home. So the extent to which the Chinese development model can be reproduced at home is open for discussion, of course, but there has been clearly a strategy to propose at least parts of this model as an alternative to the traditional Western models. And on the extreme opposite, countries like Cameroon seem much less to consider the Chinese development model as the best for their country compared to 2014. And at the same time, the US gains here in percentage point, 9 percentage point as preferred development model. And the same can be observed for countries like Sudan. So that it would be interesting also to analyze maybe a bit deeper the case of Cameroon. China has been very much present there, but it's true that there have been some projects that are still, that have been paused for several reasons that are not necessarily related to China, but also to internal political dynamics within the Cameroonian government. So it would be interesting to see to what extent this has had an effect on perceptions. Second important takeaway here is the perception of Chinese economic influence that is still very strong but slipping. So 63%, that is what the Afrobarometer survey has shown, that Chinese influence in Africa is still very positive but slipping. And this confirms the preliminary survey results from last year. So this decreasing popularity is also something to take into consideration. And I think it reflects the fact that that African citizens are becoming more critical also, and more interrogating more China's engagement and loans. But what is interesting to see is that the decreasing popularity for China, this small decreasing popularity, doesn't necessarily translate into a higher increase for the US or for former colonial powers. And the latter, so the colonial powers' popularity has sharply decreased compared to 2014. But it seems to rather benefit African regional powers and other external partners like Russia. So that's very, I think that's an important takeaway here. There's also a high, it's also important to make, what I see here is the necessity to be even more nuanced when analyzing China-Africa engagement. So, for instance, there's a high percentage of perceived political and economic influence from China and Mali. The Malians also consider the Chinese development model as, at least they prefer it, to the US, but at the same time, this doesn't necessarily translate also in an increase of perception of positive political and influence, where China loses a bit here in the case of Mali in terms of positive perceptions of economic and political influence. And so the case of Mali offers a different perspective than other Sahelian countries like Burkina Faso, like Guinea, where there's a strong correlation between the perceived political, perceived influence, but also the perceived positive influence. That's the nuances I think that it's important to make. Thirdly, I think the questions related to loans are very important, and I think that is something that both African and Chinese policymakers should really take into account, the fact that African citizens, that less than half of African citizens have heard of Chinese loans, but also that they hold their government accountable in terms of repaying these loans. I think that's very important. And also these are most located in countries where debates around Chinese debt and its repayment, but also the fear of debt distress have been very prominent. Thinking of Kenya, for instance. In countries like Zambia, Kenya, Angola, there has been a stronger, let's say they are more aware and they hold their government more accountable than in other countries. But at the same time, among all the 34 African countries that were surveyed, 58, so a majority, consider that their government has borrowed too much and that they should pay back. So it's important again, and I'll repeat myself, in this context where Chinese debt forgiveness or moratorium is being discussed and debated, and as we are heading to FOCAC, it's important that Africa-China discussions are aligned also on these perceptions around debt forgiveness. And fourth and lastly, and I'll conclude on that, is that what the data, the Afrobarometer data shows is that it is really time to debunk some myths, some of the myths. I talked about the US-China rivalry, duopoly of influence, but also here with the correlation or the perceived correlation by some between China's engagement and the loss, or the fact that this will increase autocratic values on the continent. What the data shows is that the same African citizens who said that they prefer the Chinese development model also adhere to democratic values and norms like presidential term limits, multi-party competition, accountable governance, all elements of democratic governance, and at the same time they reject one-party rule in their own home countries. So the myth of the Chinese presence having a political effect on African citizens' shift from democratic to African values is one that is false. So just to conclude, as we are a few weeks again away from one of the most important gatherings of African and Chinese officials at FOCAC, these are all important lessons to be drawn from Africa for all officials. And very importantly, that it's also important for both Chinese and African officials to take these into account, to carry out better communication and transparency around Chinese-funded projects, especially in the context where all this narrative around debt trap diplomacy and asset seizure is increasing, but also in a context where when there's no communication and transparency, it's much easier to politicize and spread false information also, whether it's by local African actors for different political gains, but also just by sometimes a lack of understanding of what is effectively happening. So I think that's very important, and I'll conclude on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your analysis, Folashada. We're going to move straight ahead, and I'm going to pass on to Professor Liu Haifeng. She is the director of the Center for African Studies at Peking University, and she is also someone who has navigated the Africa-China space for a number of years. So she's really a great person to provide some context for us. And we are very fortunate to have her join us from Beijing. Professor, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Yishan, for your very kind introduction. And thank you for Afrobarometer, the invitation, which is a so great moment to be able to join the conversation. I think I echo very much to what Folashada said. This is so timing to have this findings sharing event while FOCAC is coming again. And then I think in 2 weeks time, exactly 2 weeks time, we will say the next session move to FOCAC, to Senegal. And then everybody who are interested in China African things are super interested into your specific contribution. I think in the way, not only you are definitely giving a voice, as in the beginning, Adam already suggested, to give common people, average people, a voice about how they perceive China, Africa. But also, I think your findings is really, as Folashada said, very importantly, give lots of nuances for us to understand how when China-African collaborations implemented in different levels, specifically goes to African levels, how the local people perceive this. So with that, I think the importance are just going without saying. It's so obvious. I want to share mostly, firstly, 2 points about this contribution, the findings, the latest round of 34 countries findings, the investigations. Number one, I think this period of time, 2019 and 2021, cross a very turbulent word of a stage, and we have seen so fragmented globalizations. I think we all noticed how information not necessarily have been correctly communicated. While we have a booming, we have even the continental-wise, more and more social media are used as common people's daily base communication ways to receive information. But at the same time, we do have seen very varying, very concerning situation that how information, misconcept have been there. So with that, we have seen when I then presented, I think everyone have noticed that the findings also shows the differences to different kind of items. Sometimes for the political, economic activity, the contributions, it shows a rather positive attitude, but while you goes to the development aid, this kind of issues, you may find people not necessarily share enough information, and then let alone their people's attitude towards either government or Chinese side also doesn't necessarily show the similar kind of knowledge, information, therefore consistent attitude. So this is the number one thing I want to emphasize. The whole global setting has been very turbulent, and then with the whole world, the political, international political become very complicated. I guess African average people as a receiving end, they also have experiencing very diverging situation, the information not necessarily very informed or enoughly informed. So that's one background, I think. Second background, I want to emphasize the evolution of a China-African cooperation. I still remember 2014 when South African survey organization called South African Ethnic Institute, they released one of their findings, their surveys about Africans' perception towards Chinese business sectors. They actually invite several of Chinese experts, including Ambassador Liu Guijing and then some other Chinese experts, to join them in South Africa. We closed door for several days to really go deeper to discuss why all the survey shows so divergent situations. And then basically our South African colleagues just couldn't interpret the findings, though methodologically they have done rather differently from what Adam and then their colleagues from Afrobarometer has done, using this kind of a rather interview way to go to talk with people. The Ethic Institute had been using rather online in a questionnaire, which obviously create much deeper, much bigger problems for them to interpret. But for my understanding, so my observations for such a long period of time, we also understand clearly the relationship in itself has been evolving, and then people's knowledge have been also increasing, understanding the much sound understandings of obviously are increasing. And then even we can say Afrobarometer, such a organization, survey organization, they have done it in a very professional way. For me, several questions they have asked can't be better to understand, to address what Fellowshad just mentioned, so-called the misses. Those several misses for me, and they are huge. They are kind of very much a burden for African side, such as she was touching upon the issue that people have shared lots of concerns about China's presence in Africa, such as one question they challenged was when China has more economic activities, economic presence in African continent, it sort of spoil Africans' democracy. And then for me, this obviously is much more irrespect or ignorance of Africans' wisdom instead of give Africans voice enough attentions. So for Afrobarometer, during their investigations, they actually deliberately to ask people's understandings about or to prefer either China or US as a developmental model, or how they also view their own democracy. So these are the findings have shown us Africans themselves have enough wisdom to differentiate different kind of contribution from different external players. So obviously, if we only see the general picture or from the whole Pan-African continental perspective, we already see how the African side already gave China Chinese present a kind of credit due to their contribution to economic development. And then on the other hand, Americans' contribution might coming from democracy or other norms. And of course, there are also changes, as Fellowship already touched upon. So I think this is a very important to say how, for me, this is exactly one kind of African agency. They are not so blindly just choose or follow US or China, and then they actually has their judgment about who is doing what. So for me, this is coming from their contribution, their way of doing their investigations. And then my second idea is also comes from the complexity of the current different countries' reactions or attitude. Fellowship already mentioned the Mali's case, and then she deliberately chose banning her own country to share her findings, her observations. What I feel also very interested about those countries which have shown the decline or decrease to prefer China as a model, such as South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia. As I emphasized in the beginning, we have to notice that in the last 2 or 3 years' time, we have seen such a very turbulent world order. So information not necessarily fairly shared. Therefore, I can say at the same time, the same scope, South Africans and Zimbabwe's attitude towards US also have been decreasing. So it means it's the world is getting more and more diversified or fragmented, and then it's not a kind of a situation that there is some very constant model for South African to choose from, or Zimbabwe to choose from. There might be many different kind of element or variables which make such a kind of a configuration of a people's attitude. So basically, we should understand between the bilateral country what happened or what haven't happened, but we may also pay attention to the whole global context to understand it better. So this is, I think Zimbabwe's case also has been, if we check last 2 or 3 years' time, we have noticed that the local media have played not a friendly role for China's contribution. Too much attention have been put to China's engagement for minings, and then for other side, China's contribution seemingly has been rather ignored. So with that, we could understand better why in Zimbabwe we have seen the decrease. So this is just another case for me to understand the nuance, to understand what are the different elements, different variables that contribute to such a kind of perceptions. And then so with that, we may understand it better. And then I think what Adam emphasized is also very, very interesting for me, which is the conventional thought so far, I guess, has been with US, with China, trade war, from trade war 3 years back up till now, still fierce competition with this kind of international background. Seemingly, African has to choose, has to take side, and then there are no kind of a middle ground, and then you have to be with China or pro-US. But actually, we have seen how average people have their wisdom. They not necessarily only take sides on Chinese side or in US side. We actually can understand, can observe them, are choosing, learning from either side the good things that they think. So I think Yushan has shown some signs. Maybe my time already up. Let me stop here. Maybe there might be some questions. I thank you, Yushan, and then Afrobarometer again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. And I'm very glad that you raised this issue of African agency, that is the ability to exert influence in Africa's relationship with China. And I think this focus on citizens is also useful because we often struggle to also disaggregate where agency is located. And I think it's important to reinforce that citizens also have influence in terms of how they either reinforce or oppose national positions. So having said that, I'm going to move on to our last speaker. We are very fortunate to have an additional speaker this time round, and that is Judemois. He is a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. And Jude, given that you are based in Washington, DC, maybe you have something to highlight about the US results, but also from what I understand, you have operated at an African policy making space as well. So it'd be really interesting to hear your unique take on the findings. Over to you, Jude.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. And she said I was the last speaker. Definitely, hopefully not the least. But I thought this was really important because it sort of aligns with what I do day to day here at the Center for Global Development. I'm in the US and follow this space of the Africa-China relationship. And because I'm in the US, it's almost impossible to talk about Africa, to talk about especially China in Africa, without mentioning the great power competition that is currently evolving between the United States and China. And I think this survey is instructive for all three sets of policymakers. It is instructive for African policymakers, and I think both Chinese and US policymakers would do well to listen to what Africans are saying themselves. And so I wanted to sort of structure my comments along these lines. The first is that you're seeing that the responses and the preferences that African citizens have given to this are shaped by African realities and shaped by African preferences. This is important because there is this thing, an almost binary way of thinking about this relationship in Africa, especially from the US side, the Western side, that, China is, people are falling into the Chinese camp or people are choosing the US side. What we're seeing here is that African, these responses to these questions, how to think about these questions and where they want to go with these questions are driven by their own interests. Africans have indicated that they want accountable governments. It doesn't matter what the US is doing or what China is doing. They want their governments to be accountable, even more than effective, right? The second thing is that they want to have a say in how their leaders are chosen. So whether they appreciate or want the Chinese development model or the US model, for Africans, it's clear that in the form of choosing who governs the country, who runs the country, they want to be able to have a say in that. And they want that government to be accountable to them. And the final thing is, it's to not as much an extent as this, but we also see that across the continent, there is a certain desire for the governments to have agency, for the governments to make choices and decisions that reflect the preferences of the people, and not because of some rules that were imposed on their governments. Now, in places where, for my country, Liberia, it shows that there is a high support for rules on how that is governed. But it's not contradictory, because in places where governments want where people want their governments to be accountable, then they're going to insist that the governments are following some sort of rules. I think these 3 points are important. One, the Africans want their governments to be more accountable. Two, the Africans want a say in how the leaders are chosen. And three, that Africans want agency for their government. I think that's the first thing. And I think, as I noted from the beginning, that this is important first for African policymakers, because it shows them how their citizens perceive them and what the revealed preferences of the citizens are. So if you want to stay in power, this is the kind of stuff you do. But I think it's equally as important to the Chinese and the American counterparts. I have, as a former policymaker, one of the things that I have noted in my commentary, in my analysis and policy recommendations on the Africa-China relationship is that for the Chinese side, I think it was in 2018 or thereabouts that the Chinese president, around the 2018 FOCAC, but that China extended its anti-corruption effort to the BRI. I think it's important for China to recognize across all of Africa, there is an insistence from African citizens for more accountability. First, for more information on how these loans are given to the country, but then on accountability on the terms of these loans, because it is the revealed preference of African citizens that they want their governments to be more accountable. Now, if you want your government to be accountable, then if your government is taking loans, people would want to know that what those loans are and what the terms of those loans are. I think that's really, really important for Chinese policymakers who are dealing with African policymakers. But I think for the US too, this is important, that every single thing that happens in Africa is not because people are falling under China's influence. That everything that's happening, especially insofar as private citizens, ordinary citizens in Africa are concerned, it's not simply about some great power competition. Some of this stuff, as I noted before, is driven largely by African interests and African realities. So I think this is important for the three sets of policymakers. And I think most importantly for the US is for them to recognize through this that Africans still see an important and critical role for China in their society. So this idea isn't that Africans are going to completely fall into one camp or the other. And I think that leads me to my next point, which is there is room for cooperation. There is room in Africa for both China, the United States, and other external actors. The continent is too large, its needs too diverse for any one partner to provide all of what it needs. There are unique competencies that the US has that are very useful. The US invests significantly in human capital, in health and education, whereas the Chinese invest significantly in physical hard infrastructure. Africa has need for both of them. And so I think if you look at the results today, where perceptions of China and the United States are sort of close, it is an indication that Africans recognize that each of them brings a unique set of competence that is useful for their continent. So for example, B3W is merely going to target soft infrastructure projects, right? Like climate, like health, and like security. Whereas, China is going to continue to invest in roads, in ports, in rail. Africa has significant need for both. We need to create anywhere between 12 to 18 million jobs a year. Well, those jobs are not simply going to be created because of Chinese presence in Africa, nor are they only going to be created because of the US presence in Africa. So I think both of them have significant role to play on the continent. I think the one final thing that I would say is that, on the question of how Africans perceive China, is also because, there isn't significant differentiation between the Chinese state and Chinese individuals. So some of the negative perceptions about China in places have come from Chinese private sector groups, right? Whether it's in the DRC or it's in Kenya, where a Chinese company doesn't follow the rule, or a supervisor at a Chinese company. When these videos become viral, it ends up riling up people and turning people, some of the negative thing toward China. Whereas on the US side, people can make a clear distinction between a US private sector company and the US government, right? So something that a US private sector does or the US individual does is not immediately attributed to China, to the US government, whereas that distinction is not really clear when it comes on the Chinese side. So China both benefits from this and then faces the consequences of it, because if a Chinese private sector group does something really great, it is attributed to China, right? Whereas again, I think on the US side, people can sometimes make that distinction. But the final thing that I would say, and then I will close because we want to give people an opportunity to ask questions here, is that if we wanted any evidence of how Africans perceive both the United States and China, I think we find it here in these survey results. They see both of them as important to their economic growth. They see both of them as important to their society, but they do not want to see them as influential on them. They want agency for their governments, and they want their governments to be more accountable to them. I think nothing could be clearer than that from this. So I'll end here and be open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your input, Jude. So I'm going to ask all the speakers to come back on screen, and we're going to move straight into the discussion session. I have been frantically multitasking and listening and collecting the questions. So what we're going to do, I think we're going to take a first round of 3 to 4 questions, and I've tried to record all the questions. So I'm going to start straight away. Christian wants to know, and I think this question actually came up last year. It's more of a methodology question. They want to know regarding the Chinese or US model, how are these models defined and presented, and what are their characteristics? And perhaps the analysts have something to say regarding, I think, models and their attributes as well. That's the first question. I think the second one was somewhat answered, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Also, Christian wants to know regarding debunking myths. Is it safe to say that on one hand, Africans are attached to a Western democratic values of rules of law, freedom, multipartism, and on the other hand, they are attracted to stability, discipline, order displayed through this Chinese model? And then the third question looks at, I think again, it's methodology, is this idea of African countries have large populations, tribes, and political divides. And I think basically they want to understand how the survey captures all of this, and whether there is interest, whether there are plans to, I think, increase respondent numbers. And then I have a question, which is, I think it is very hard to directly pin the impact of global events on changes in perceptions. But I'm curious to find out whether any of you think that the data reflects changes such as the impact of the COVID pandemic. Also, I think other global events such as a change in US president since last year, as well as maybe the launch of the African Continental Free Trade Area. So I'm just wondering if any of the data might reflect some of these changes as well. So I'm going to hand over, I think, to Adam first, and we'll go through the order of the program one more time. If there's any inputs you have for those 4 questions, please go ahead. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So I think the questions are appropriately mine. So on the question on whether we define the models for ordinary people to respond to, I'd say no. So what I do is I read the question as exactly as we post it to our respondents. So it's a simple question that goes like, in your opinion, which of the following countries, if any, would be the best model for future development of your country? Or is there some other country in Africa or elsewhere that should be our model? And usually would list the countries, so it's not an entirely open-ended question. So we list several countries, including the US, China, the previous colonial power, and so on and so forth. So that is how the question is posed, but we don't go to the extent of defining either the US model or the Chinese model. But what I can say to that is usually when, and I think that that was mentioned earlier on, that, Africans' opinions are shaped by what they see and what they hear, and most importantly, their aspirations. So when we ask this question, and I'll get it into the mind of the respondent now, is that they're looking at the country that is giving them support, be it the US or China or a former colonial power, and looking at their country and comparing that to their country. Now, if let's say the US is giving you development aid or supporting you with your infrastructure, you definitely want to be like that country that is supporting you. So I think that is how respondents begin to interpret that question when we ask them to choose or to select a model for their country. Now, for me, as I was presenting, I did say that we've now seen that a marginal percentage of people are saying that the development models should follow their own country's model. That's quite interesting. Now, going to the question about sample size, and I think that's what was asked in the other question, which is that Africa has a multitude of political parties, ethnic groups, and so on and so forth. Yes, that is true. And of course, that can again be distilled if you wanted to drill down, for instance, on the ethnic groups or political party affiliation of those who said they preferred a particular model. We could, of course, analyze that. But now going back to the question about the sample size, and what we always say is we could as much as increase the sample size to several thousands beyond what we currently do, but our margin of error and our confidence level in the data, the findings that we get is quite significant, and of course shows the level of understanding and the level of the depth of our sample size, be it 2,400 or 1,200. So the sample size as it stands is good to get the basic responses that we want to get. But if we wanted to do additional analysis using ethnic groups of where we collected the data from, or political affiliation, or any other social demographic, that definitely is possible. I think I've covered both methodological questions. Right, yeah. Thank you.
Hey, Folashada, over to you.
Yes, very briefly. So the questions on whether Africans are attached to Western democratic norms, but also have some preferences for Chinese specific norms. First, I think it's one should be careful not to consider all the different norms that were presented in the surveys as meaning Western and democracy are not necessarily. These norms were also pre-existing. If you read the works of Amartya Sen, for instance, on how democratic rules, freedom were pre-existing before the colonial era in many countries in the global South. So I think Africans are attached to these as seen by or as reflected by these surveys. It's just that they don't consider these and adherence to the Chinese development models and criteria as mutually exclusive. That's what I understood from, that's what I got out of this, out of the survey results, is that they consider both to be, meaning a Chinese economic presence, a good relationship with China, are not, will not necessarily affect how their attachment to these specific norms. So I think that's really important as a takeaway here. And on your question on the impact of COVID and other global events, it's a bit of a difficult question, but it's a very important one. I think that African public opinion is shaped by a variety of factors, actors, local, national media, citizens' own views based on their experience and interaction with specific phenomenon, with specific elites, politics, and actors. It's really important what Jude mentioned about, when you say China to various African citizens, who is it that they view? Is it the Chinese businessman? Is it the Chinese government? So it's all of this has an impact on the way they see China. In the case of the COVID pandemic, there might have been some influence, I suppose, because there's been a very active diplomacy carried out by Chinese actors, what has been dubbed as mass diplomacy, but it has been a strong humanitarian effort to provide masks, PPEs, and later on also vaccines. So this must have had, I suppose, an effect on how they view China, how African citizens view China as a partner that provides concrete support. But at the same time, the COVID pandemic and the views on China can also be interpreted under the lens that many have considered that since it emanated, or at least the first cases were in China, that maybe there's also some responsibility there. So, there's a balance here to make, and it's a bit difficult to have a straight answer, but definitely there must have been some impacts there.
And Prof, over to you.
Thank you, Yishan. Thank you for the question. I think I agree most of what have been said by fellow Shada. The same two questions, just to add a little bit. First, about the norm, the value things. I think exactly as fellow Shada emphasized, I would rather emphasize again about the African content. We have to go to specific which local we are talking about, such as I remember one of the release from Afrobarometer in their investigation to the Mali political situation, how people view of the current political situation, who are you going to listen to? And then majority of Mali people actually choose their military leader, which obviously it's hard to judge just using it is authoritarian or just non-democratic. We cannot just immediately judge from this kind of a terminologies. We have to go to specific of this country's history, the situation, ongoing situation, before we could fully understand this local content. My echo to the COVID or the current global event, I also agree with. I think in some of the countries we have seen the so-called China virus or Asian virus had played some role, like in South Africa, in Zambia, where we have seen some Chinese ethnics were killed or were just harmed simply due to this kind of rumors, this type of messages. So of course, it's not a cutting across all the continental situation. We do have the majority of those African countries. This is not so popular, but with that, COVID definitely about those rumors play some role, just more or less in different cases. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jude.
Sure. I think this goes back to my point, and Shade sort of alluded to it about, when the question is posed to the average person on the street about China, what do they perceive? What are they responding to? Like what version of the Chinese government or Chinese society are they responding to? But I think the important thing for us who see this, at least from my perspective, is that at the core of the Chinese model is economic rights, right? It's not as if China doesn't value human rights. It's just that at the core of the Chinese model is economic rights, whereas at the core of the US model is human rights. Everything is centered around human rights. And that's why I think in African societies, it is also a very attractive proposition. If you're a very, very poor person, I think people are willing to give up some rights so that the economic situation can improve, and maybe not even give up those rights, but focus more on their economic rights. And so there is an appeal to China's proposition. I think on the COVID question about perception, there are both good and bad elements of it, right? So when COVID first started, the first big response that we saw in Africa came from Chinese source. It was the Jack Ma Foundation that was delivering COVID tests and materials in every single African country, even Eritrea, right? Every country got something from there. And it was huge because when these material arrived, it was the Chinese ambassador or the commercial counselor who received it and handed it over. And so it was a huge boost for China's soft power. Even up to today, China has exported, both as gifts and sales, vaccines more than any other vaccine manufacturer, right, across the world to the development. So that has helped. But it's also important to note that one of the most difficult moments in the Africa-China relationship occurred during this, when in Guangzhou and places, there were videos on the internet showing Africans who were being kicked out of places where they were staying. And on Twitter, at least on social media across the continent, people were holding their governments to account. We saw instances where I think it was the speaker in Nigeria called in the Chinese ambassador. And so that disruption occurred also around COVID. So I think that there were good parts about this, especially into how perception of China was. And then there were those difficult moments too. But overall, I think China might come out of this thinking and believing, and justifiably so, that they have actually enhanced their perception in the eyes of the average African in their response to COVID.
Thank you, Jude. So I know we are almost out of time, but we would like to address as many questions as we can, and I hope that's okay with all of you. I'm going to actually what I'll do is I'm first going to give the floor to, I think, Dr. Victor Ease. He wanted to make an input. I think perhaps you could do that in under a minute. That would be great. I'm going to then hand over the screen to you. Thank you. Are you there, Victor?
Okay, I'm here.
Perfect.
I'm here. I can't see myself on the screen, but I'll go ahead and make my contribution.
We can hear you, Victor.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the perception of China's engagement with African countries can also be affected by who is being interrogated or surveyed. For instance, my PhD research, which focused on newspaper framing and public perception of China's engagement with Nigeria, revealed that the public, especially the elite, who have something to do with China, or who are stakeholders, or who work closely with China, or who are interested in the Sino-African relations, usually perceive China's engagement with Nigeria or Africa as a whole as something positive. Most of these elites gain directly or indirectly, in one way or the other, from the China's engagement with Nigeria, with Africa. So it's likely to define, so it's very, very important, to define who is being surveyed when the issue of perception is involved. The public must be defined appropriately, and that should also be all-encompassing for a balanced survey result to be arrived at. Taking that further, the bulk of the problem about the perception of China is hinged on the fact that the government of the day, especially in Nigeria and in most African countries, is not very open to the masses. They do not disclose the full information about their day-to-day dealings with China, especially when it comes to the various loans which countries like Nigeria take from China. And that directly ties to corruption. And it appears as if China also enjoys that lack of transparency of most African leaders in disclosing their dealings with China. So China seems to revel in the corruption of African leaders. So I want to ask, how was the issue of corruption considered in the survey by Afrobarometer? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Victor. So I am going to, this is going to be the last round. So for any of the speakers, and we'll reverse the order this time, have anything to respond in terms of Victor's question on corruption, you're welcome to do so. I'm going to add 2 more questions. The first, I think, is to Folashado, but I think anyone might have a view on this, is largely this issue of bilateral engagement. I think what Emmanuel is trying to say here is that are the survey results or the nuances in these countries driving China's preference for bilateral relations? And on the other hand, or is the actual engagement, China's engagement in these countries driving these survey results? It's kind of a chicken and egg question. And then the second question is from Sanusha, and she wants to know, regarding the data findings, where or what sources of information do you think that the respondents rely on regarding the information on China, US, and other external actors? So those are the 3 questions. I'm going to first hand over to Jude, and any closing remarks that you have at the same time, please would you include that? Thank you.
Again, it's really, really great pleasure being here. Significant respect for Afrobarometer. They're probably the only one who are doing what they're doing, especially in the way they do it. I hope they continue to get support from all of us in the policy circle, but especially the people who fund the kind of work they do too. I think on this question, Shadi mentioned this on the question of, what's shaping the perception, to Emmanuel's question. In Kenya today, this is a very, very big question. There's actually a case in court where civil society activists are suing the Kenyan government to provide the details of the standard gauge rail deal. And so the more that happens in a country, it shapes people's perception, right? Whether people are listening to talk shows. I mean, most people get their news from the internet or from listening to radio, not television in Africa. And so if this is the kind of stuff that is on television, on radio, if this is the stuff people are sharing in their WhatsApp groups or on Facebook, then that's going to shape how people get information about this. I think on the corruption question, I don't know that there is anything unique about Chinese projects that on the corruption question. I think in countries that are governed properly, where there's a control of corruption, you see the same. And then in places where there's weak governance and corruption is not controlled, it affects projects, whether it's from the private sector or from government sectors. And so I think that's really important. But it comes back to my question, and if I will close with anything, it would be like, 1, I think it's important for China, because China is still the dominant actor when it comes to bilateral lending. For China to at least Chinese policymakers, as we go into FOCAC, to understand here that it is the revealed preference, the stated preference of Africans whom their loans are supposed to benefit, that they want the governments to be accountable. The way you do that is to be more open about these agreements. The second thing is that if Africans begin to perceive that Chinese activity in Africa are going counter to their revealed preferences, you can imagine how they will begin to turn against China, and their perception of China will begin to turn negative. So I think it's important for China in this lending to Africa to focus on what these perceptions are, what these realities are, and that would be my closing statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude. Professor Liu, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Yishan. I think I will address 2 questions. I didn't hear clearly about the last question about the multilateral. If possible, Yishan, if you could just repeat it again. It's about to get more information about the multilateral influences. Was it I didn't understand. Yeah, maybe I just address other things. First, I want to say a few words about the corruption issues. I think I don't want to just on behalf of China or Chinese government to defend anything, but I think there is a very good research outcome just lately published by Professor Deborah Brotigan Carey, China African Research Initiative. If you can search their website, it's quite well circulated about so-called hidden debt. She was using lots of proof to suggest based on those several contracts which she has the original form she disclosed. She explained the issue very well. This is not about because the contract didn't say that China don't allow the African side to announce, to publish. It's up to the African side whether the government would like to disclose enough information about loan or any kind of financial business. So yeah, this would be the good one for us to refer it to understand it better. About the bilateral engagement, I think I very much agree with definitely how those implementers, we have heard Judy mentioned a kind of a situation that China in front of African average people may not able to distinguish the Chinese government actors from the private sectors. I think this is also a kind of a situation to show that the ignorance, the lack of enough understandings of each other. And we do see very active Chinese diplomat on the ground. And also there are quite a number of Chinese NGOs. Some are public NGOs like the Poverty Alleviation. Their association have been based in several countries, Ethiopia, Kenya, to do lots of this type of engagement. And of course, you also have a quite a complex engagement from business sector, be it state-owned company or the private companies, which 100% self-financed. So all this mixed and then indeed create a kind of a situation. But I think still the more those Chinese actors are aware about the local society, respect them, and then do have lots of engagement. And then plus there is one fact I think which is so obvious, that Chinese presence, as Judy mentioned, the economic engagement, but also very different kind of economic engagement, different from Chevron, from all those super huge U.S. companies presence. China were mostly acting in a rather lower rank, those kind of business low streams. So they are much more visible, therefore more vulnerable in the way. If they couldn't reach a kind of a better understanding, better culture engagement, then people-to-people relationship become the big, maybe biggest barriers for this perceptions, and then people want and have a better understandings, better perceptions towards Chinese. Yeah, this is just my add to the discussion, the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And over to Folashada.
Yes, very briefly about Dr. Victor Eze's question. I think I'll hand that over to Adam because it has specifically to do with Afrobarometer's methodology. But my understanding is that surveys are asked to people beyond just the elites. I think there were several slides that showed the huge variety of African citizens that have been surveyed: men, women, rural, urban, from rural, urban areas, the age, but also, you know, the various, the different categories of people. So I'll leave that to Adam, but I think that it's this variety that is so interesting here, and that shows how, you know, how differently many of them also think. So that's very important. Secondly, very briefly, the question on Chinese preference for bilateral engagement. I think here it's important. My understanding and my analysis from China-Africa relations is that, yes, there's a strong preference for bilateral engagement and, you know, government-to-government relations from China's government and to African governments, but at the same time, they seem to play on both levels, you know, bilateral and multilateral engagement. It's something of a combination of multilateral ism or engagement, where, you know, at the same time there will be bilateral donations from China to African governments, if you look at the COVID pandemic scenarios, but also some input in is it COVAX? Yeah, in the COVAX scheme. Yes, so same on, you know, on discussions around debt. There's a preference for bilateralism, but there's some input in the multilateral area, multilateral engagement. So I think it's to have a better analysis, it's important to look at it maybe on a case-by-case basis, but definitely there's both are present. So I'll leave it now to Adam.
Adam, go ahead.
So yes, I think Fola, you did do justice to the sample for us. So, you know, I think part of the one beautiful thing about what Afrobarometer does is that it goes to ordinary African citizens to ask them questions. Now, you know, the idea is that it's only, you know, those who are educated and so-called elites who can respond to certain questions. And of course, like as Victor says, you know, elites have their views about, you know, their perceptions about China is more positive. Of course, you know, the China-Africa relations is always a government-to-government relationship. But ordinary citizens form their opinions based on, you know, the experiences, what they see. Not beyond, you know, the contracts and agreements that are signed between governments, but it's mainly what they experience, what they see. They see the huge so-called Chinese malls springing up in their countries. They see the infrastructure, they see all kinds of things. And I think I said this in our last, when we presented 18 country findings, that, you know, there are many people in Africa whose first experience with China would have been through Chinese food, or even through the outfit I wear, what we call the Chinese collar in Ghana. So, I mean, perceptions are formed, you know, through a variety of things, you know, and it's getting more sophisticated for ordinary Africans. And for us, that is the basis of what Afrobarometer does. It's to go to ordinary Africans and ask them questions that will ask elites, and they being able to give us their opinions. And that, for me, it's the best part of what Afrobarometer does, asking ordinary people questions. And that being said, we do not know who is ever selected in the sample. Like I said, it's so random that when the sample takes the interviewers to the remotest part of the countries in which we collect the data, they must go there because that's where the sample has taken them. And like I said, people are asked questions in the language that they understand, and, you know, going through the trouble of translating the questions so that, you know, respondents can understand and respond to us. And I think that is something that is worth appreciating by everybody, you know, regardless of the sample size. And now we've stood by our sample size for many, many years since Afrobarometer started. Afrobarometer sample size has been able to predict so many things, including some of the, you know, the trouble we've seen in many African countries. You know, we've been able to predict with our sample size the trouble in Mali, in Burkina Faso, even in Sudan. And that is, again, important to explain that it's not so much as to how many people get interviewed at any point in time, but it's about, you know, the responses we get telling us something about what Africans think, what they think about themselves, their own lives, their government, what they want. And it's so important. And I'll just conclude by saying that one of the things that Afrobarometer wants to do now is to cover the entire continent. I think that's what is most important now, that we are able to, you know, conduct a survey in all of the 54 countries in, is it 54 or 52? 54 countries in Africa. As if there's any wish that can be granted, is to be able to cover the entire continent and even continue to ask these questions that are being asked. And as you see, the first time we asked questions about China was in 2000, in the round 6 survey. We were only able to ask it again in this current round. And if, you know, we had enough funds, would go as far as, you know, we can go. So that's where I'll end it for the questions. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Adam. So I think we have run out of time for more discussion. Perhaps Afrobarometer or some of the speakers can actually respond to the questions over their Twitter page or something. There are, I think, 1 or 2 remaining questions. But to sum up, I think that an overriding theme is this idea of myths. And also, I think that understanding this relationship really requires more nuance. There are so many complexities. And I think another point is that this survey, especially this round, is a snapshot in time. And we can see that through each round, there are also subtle changes. And we have to be aware that as researchers, policymakers, and citizens, that we have to take data into context. Because like Folashada said earlier, that sometimes data and information can become politicized or used for narrow interest. And we have to make sure that we guard against that as well. I will say, however, that a good measure of a successful discussion is when there's still so many remaining gaps and questions to answer. And I think this only motivates for more discussion. So I really do hope that this discussion continues offline, because it's too important of a discussion and conversation to end here. In fact, Afrobarometer has a forthcoming publication that they have, I think, promoted on the chat, or you can find it on their website. And I also think that this is not the last time that you will hear from the speakers regarding this topic. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for allowing me to guide this discussion. I want to give a big thanks to the organizers, Adam and Afrobarometer, because I think, as some of the speakers have already said, the role and importance in elevating the African citizen's voice, your role in this, does not go unnoticed. And you can see that by the type of participation we have here today. Also to the speakers for joining us on such different time zones. Thank you so much for your time. And also to all of you who participated. Thank you for participating and also learning with us today. So on that note, I'm going to officially close this event, and I hope you all stay healthy and safe. Thank you. Thank you very much.